Hi, good afternoon. I'm Bill Gaventa talking to you from Austin, Texas. Today we're going to be talking about the dance of collaboration, moving from strangers to friendships and partnerships. I don't know who's watching today, but I'm guessing it's advocates, families, professionals, friends of people with disabilities, members of faith communities. Certainly, people with disabilities and their families have relationships with both service systems and advocacy groups on the one hand and faith communities on the other. Those relationships may be good or not so good, depending upon multiple factors and experiences. But for families, support agencies and services and faith communities, it too often feels like they're living in separate worlds, or to use an illustration from childhood, like people playing in separate sandboxes, or worse yet, the phenomenon of parallel play, played in the same sandbox, but not playing with one another. The question is, how do congregations and support agencies, both who may be important in the lives of families and people with disabilities, be supportive and connect and partner with one another for the sake of more complete inclusion and better supports? Eric Carter documented some of this in a major study of about 500 families in Tennessee, asking about the importance of spirituality and faith in their lives. A huge majority of those families reported that spirituality was important to them in their lives and in their homes, something like 75%. But when asked who supported them in helping to live out that important dimension of their lives, uh, public systems and faith communities got pretty low marks. Public services like schools or agencies never ask about that dimension of life or those interests that people had or families had. Faith communities too often failed to respond when families sought the kind of supports needed for them to participate as a whole family in their faith community. The irony, of course, in that is that both service systems and churches, synagogues, mosques all see themselves, we profess to be person and family centered, seeking to help people to live lives of participation and connection. So why, might be asked, are some of the reasons for the lack of better collaboration between the public systems on the one hand and faith communities on the other? One, these are different worlds of helping with different strengths and languages and different understandings of caring, different policies, different concerns about credentials. Put people of faith in the world of agencies and systems. If those people do not work there, it's a world of acronyms, attitudes, and processes that are so much different from the way faith communities might respond to a person or to a family with some kinds of support. Put a really good social worker or a direct support professional or outreach worker in the world of all the faith communities in any given community or city or town, and that becomes another confusing set of acronyms, of labels, of attitudes, a huge diversity of styles and customs that are much different from the school or the agency in which they may work. We never got any training in this, is a refrain you might hear from both leaders in faith communities and from professionals who work in educational and adult service systems. Thankfully, the language of spirituality is one of the ways that people are beginning to be able to talk about the same thing that may be important to individuals and families. A second reason is that there are misconceptions about the separation of church and state in disability services and healthcare. Some in the service world would have you believe that you can't talk about religion with individuals and families because they get public funding. That's wrong. You can, but you cannot proselytize, and you should not. But you can talk about spirituality and faith as a dimension of people's lives. Holistic, person-centered, and family-centered care almost demands that you do so. But a third reason But both worlds also lead experiences by families and individuals often lead to suspicion between those worlds at times. Both might hear about an individual or family struggle with or problem with another. Educators, human service professionals, and advocates have heard stories about the neglect or outright rejection that some individuals with disabilities and their families have experienced in faith communities sometimes. Pastors or others in faith communities may hear about desperate searches by individuals and families for services or supports, or dissatisfaction with some medical service or some teacher, and are often stymied because they don't know what to do in the face of these huge bureaucracies to support the people from whom they're hearing these stories from. And like many in the general public, people who work in faith communities have for years heard the kind of motto that you need special training to work with people with special needs or with disabilities, and are some to be able to really be of help. No wonder that people sometimes avoid things or doing things or don't know how to do things, and thus not doing anything and disempowering people. In fact, what faith families most need is not for clergy and others to feel disempowered about a particular thing, but to ask and to be open and to be willing to learn. I bet all of you who are watching have your stories about this, kind of on both sides of helping and support. When talking with individuals and families, we need to be prepared to hear them and take them seriously. If there have been experiences of pain or hurt in either world, we need to listen to those without defensiveness, because that's a first step in really taking people seriously. Truly listening is the first step of any helper. Collaboration beyond that is the next step, and maybe retrying or working together. But people need first to trust you, and to trust you, they need you to hear their stories. Remember, partnerships and collaboration take time. Miroslav Volf talks about the dance of embrace in his book called Exclusion and Embrace, which is not about disability at all, but about building community and relationships between people from different cultures and nationalities and religions. He asked, are we as Christians called to embrace the other? And our reflexive answer to that would be usually, sure, of course we are. That's what we're supposed to do. That's what the commandments are, or that's what Jesus did. But his answer is no. He says, that's not what we're called to do. We're called to have the will to embrace the other, but not just to go and embrace the other. And that happens if you can envision a person here and a person here kind of moving towards each other, wanting to build a relationship. That happens by lowering one's guard, lowering hands into signs of welcome, moving towards somebody, but then before going and embracing too quickly, stepping back, learning and listening and talking, and beginning to build the kind of relationship that may then lead to a closer or actual physical embrace. Lots of people in the world can tell you, women and people with disabilities in particular, can tell you about feeling like people have moved to touch or embrace them too quickly in ways that feel invasive, or to come and put your hands on somebody to pray over them. But on the other side of these barriers, there are all kinds of values and resources and policies and trends that speak to the potential and value of effective partnership between individuals, families, agencies, schools, and faith communities. Some of them that you can learn about and rely upon are that in the world of human services, the values and methods of what's called person-centered planning and self-determination speak clearly to listening carefully to what's important to individuals and families, not just to what's important for them in terms of services, but what's important to them, and respecting and supporting their interest and their choices and their dreams, not ours for them or our treatment plan or our plan of action. What do they want and need in their lives, and how can we help them achieve that? Secondly, agencies are supposed to be culturally competent by federal policy and by funding. And you cannot address cultural competence without addressing the ways that faith shapes the particular cultures that people may be part of, whether that's in the African American community, Hispanic community, an immigrant community, a South Asian community, or older European communities where Catholic churches or Protestant groups might be core community centers in those particular groups. You've got to be culturally competent. You need to know something about that. On the other side, almost every congregation has a sign in their lawn or on their website that says everybody's welcome. And you can't address that without then thinking about how we welcome everybody, no matter their limitations or abilities. In the language of human services, faith communities are also the biggest example of what are called, in quotes, natural generic community support organizations, a mainstay about what professional systems and helpers say individuals and families need, in addition to whatever professional services they receive from schools or health or human service systems. How are families supported by those natural systems in the community? Well, faith communities are the biggest example of those in this country. And what's more, their treasure chest of potential connections and relationships, many different kinds of activities, and in other words, social capital. Fifth, the power of spirituality and spiritual supports in multiple areas of healthcare and in human service and quality of life is being demonstrated and has been demonstrated in all kinds of research studies. But most of those have been in general medical care or in mental health care. Not a lot of that has taken place in the world of intellectual and developmental disabilities, but that is changing and should be encouraged. But look for the results of the research that talk about the importance and the power of spirituality. And sixth, people are more than single stories defined by one characteristic. People with disabilities and their families are more than their story of disability or that label of disability. People who belong to faith communities are more than that story of what their faith identity is. There are multiple stories that make up all of us, and we need multiple ways to connect and belong to and with others who share the interests that we do, maybe share our beliefs, share our values, share our passions. Ideally, people need multiple organizations and networks who claim them as their members. We all need our people, so to speak, whatever our interest might be. And finally, no expert, no matter what kind, knows everything. No place or organization can meet all the needs and wishes that a person might have. So as professionals, whether in the religious world or in the human service world, the real skill is not how much you know, but whether or not we know what we don't know. So we'll be willing to ask and to listen and to learn. I am, for one, more willing to trust someone who says to me, I don't know, but I can find out, and I'll help you do that. There's a handout for this session that has a list of suggestions for service agencies on how they might think about relating to faith communities who also can be supportive to the individuals and families they support. And on the other side of that handout is a list of suggestions for congregations about how they might reach out in ways to look for collaboration and partnership with service agencies and schools who play a major role in these people's lives. Read them carefully And you'll see that in many ways, they mirror what could happen in one another. They are processes of inward learning and training and outward invitation and request for partnership and for collaboration and seeking to be a partner for the sake of the individuals and the families whom we both know. If you want specific resources for any of these ideas, ask around today for who has done something like that, or send me an email or search online. Who you don't know and what they might know. Who do you know who knows what you might want to know, and who do they know? Believe in what we call the gospel of Kevin Bacon and 6 degrees of separation as ways to connection and of learning. Believe me, you can name almost any service or support for people with disabilities and their families in this country, and there's probably a congregation somewhere doing that. And on the other hand, there are agencies and schools who have figured out ways to work collaboratively with faith communities. We can talk about those in specifics, but I know my limits and yours. But let me share with you a couple of examples. Partnering through involvement in the planning processes that happen for families, for children with disabilities and their families, and for adults. Every person or family has the right to invite others to be part of annual planning processes, such as a person-centered planning meeting or an individual education plan, an IEP meeting at a church, at a school. More than a quarter century ago, I was speaking to a Down Syndrome Association conference in South Carolina, and I asked the families who were there after I talked, I said, tell me your church stories. And one of my favorite stories ever, a mom got up and said, our church has been terrific. We took our pastor with us to our IEP meeting at the school. We got everything we wanted, ... They thought he was our lawyer. Usually receives lots of laughs from any audience where I tell that story, but it's kind of the knowing laughs about, think about how those meetings might change if families had a sense that they had an ally with them, a person who or a community standing with them and behind them, wanting to learn what they can do also to support a child or a family. And vice versa, what the school can learn by maybe what a faith community is doing with an individual and with a child to support them. It really would help to balance the kind of forces of power at play and move then towards partnership and collaboration. Second example is helping people with disabilities get jobs. Unemployment is one of the biggest needs in the lives of people with disabilities. Twice as many people with disabilities are unemployed as are people without disabilities. How do people get jobs? How do we get these jobs? Often through connections, more so than on the web or through some kind of program. Some of us, Eric Carter and others, and I were in some university centers of excellence, were involved in a project you may have heard about called Putting Faith to Work, which hypothesized that faith communities could be organized to help people with disabilities find employment opportunities in their community. It wasn't rocket science, it was work. The basic idea was taking advantage of the capacity of caring faith communities to organize around a specific human need or person that they sense or feel in that community, and then figure out some ways of support. That you get a community like that around an individual with a disability, talk to them, get to know them in terms of what their skills, their dreams, their hopes are, maybe with their families as well, and then talk with others then about, help us think of ways to find job opportunities or job training opportunities or testing opportunities, trial opportunities or internships for this person who we know and is part of our faith community. It's not It's not starting a supported employment program. It's helping Joanne or John or Diane or Jim, somebody get a job. And it's then utilizing the social capital, the employers and employees in your congregation, to make connections with others in the community who might just be willing to try a person who's got the skills or the gifts that the person that you're working with has. That's a great way to collaborate, again, between faith communities and agencies. Third, think about Special Olympics, which is important for many children and adults with disabilities and their families. There are congregations around the country who come out en masse to volunteer at Special Olympics meets and thereby give witness to that faith community's support for those kinds of athletic activities and events that give people a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment and celebration. Some congregations are also hosting parental support and individual support groups. They have parent groups or ways for people to help support one another. Others have used the circle of support model that comes out of the world of disability and person-centered planning and community building, around building a group of people around an individual who help care, be allies of that person, but also support one another in those allyship tasks. There's a great little video called Believing, Belonging, Becoming, which tells several vignettes. It's a short video of 11 minutes of ways in which circles of support have been organized or helped in some congregational inclusion projects. Look it up online, Believing, Belonging, Becoming. If you can't find it, send me an email. And finally, one way to build some partnerships, between faith communities and agencies and others is coming together around addressing issues of loss and grief, which permeate the lives of many people with disabilities and their families. But in the lives of adults with disabilities, for instance, who may be supported by an agency, staff changing, moves, loss of friends, loss of family members, those are all times that may involve senses of loss and grief. And agencies sometimes don't have the kinds of resources or relationships built up to help that happen. Too often, they've not helped build relationships with faith communities where there are people who are used to dealing with grief and loss and being a supportive community around an individual or, a whole kind of false family. Sorry, we just got an Amber Alert on my phone here in Texas. It's something that happens when somebody thinks they've been kidnapped by somebody, a child or an adult. But again, going back to addressing grief and loss, congregations could approach agencies and say, when you're dealing with grief and loss among staff or the people that you support, let us know. We'd be glad to be resources. And particularly, it's a reason for congregations who support different people, for them to help those people be involved in the faith communities in which they would like to. And some places around the country have formed kind of a grief response team that includes people, pastors and social workers and people from hospice or maybe medical centers that can respond to situations of grief where there's not an organized community or natural community around them that can be supportive of people. The list could go on about ways of building partnership and collaboration. You could help me add to it, and I wish you would if you had some good examples. But suffice it to say, I think both these days, in these days of social media and more, both faith communities and agencies have a choice to make around inclusive faith supports that has to do with what the commercial world calls branding or public relations, and what the faith world or the Christian world calls witness or evangelism, or just demonstrating the actions of a faith community in caring for the wider community. A faith community that works hard at inclusion of one or more people with disabilities in their families. It's kind of like dropping a stone in a pond, because the ripple effects will go out. Others will hear about it. Maybe teachers of a kid's school in their classes in school will hear about the good things a church is doing, or a synagogue, or a mosque, or in an adult world, an agency may hear about it. And people then, that makes an impact. And relatives, teachers, agency staff, other families, and more. In reverse, if there's a negative experience, those same ripples go out. But so we have a choice about how important our welcome is, and hospitality to people with disabilities and their families. An agency that pays attention to this and pays attention to the spiritual needs and interests of individuals that they support and serve, and say one that then would call up and they did a dialogue and a good assessment in their process of talking with individuals, children, and adults and families, and found out that was an important area of life, but maybe an area in which they need some help. Think about an agency that then would call up a faith community and after asking the individual and family, and say, can we help you with this? Because they really would like to be more involved. And we see that as a really important source of support for this individual or family. Think about ways that could be a witness to what you do as an agency. And again, that goes out. And as congregations have become more inclusive, one of the things that's happened often is that young people in those congregations also begin to see working in the world of services and supports for people with disabilities as a vocational option and a way for them to live out their calling. But a negative experience with either side can travel like wildfire these days. So the importance of really trying to be welcoming and opening and follow through on these quality of life issues is just hugely important. You remember also that members of faith communities are the biggest source of volunteers, donations, and community leadership. For an agency, having faith communities see your agency and its work at its best is a huge plus. One of the ironies in all this is that when we work so hard for people with disabilities and their families, or trying to help build community supports for them, one of the ironies is that as we collaborate with others and trying to do so, what's interesting is that if you look at it from another perspective, it's actually those people and those families who are helping to build community that will help the rest of us. That by working together, we build a sense of a more inclusive community and partnership between faith communities and health and human service organizations that may be good for many others, not just the individuals that we're working with. So one of the beauties of this and the paradoxes is that we work on these kinds of relationships, that the community building that's going on is beneficial, not just for the individuals with disabilities and families who so often need that, but also for so many others who may be parts of congregations and the communities in which we all live and serve. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll take a look at those suggestions, have time to talk with others about them. Feel free to contact me. My email is on there as well. And good luck as you work at these important partnerships to build a more inclusive and supportive world for the people who've called us to serve. Thank you.